Present.
Commissioner Thomas Hicks.
Present.
We have a full slate of commissioners here today. Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
I move we adopt the agenda.
Second.
Any objections? The agenda is adopted. So I want to thank everybody for being here. This is an important hearing. This is our third hearing on the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines 2.0, the Principles and Guidelines document that has been out for public comment since the end of March, and the comments are open until May 29th. It is important for us to hear from all sectors of the election community and those who are interested, our stakeholders. And so today we have some additional stakeholders who will be testifying for us, and we'll also hear from our executive director. And no, we're not going to hear from you. You're on the schedule. Okay. So thank you again for being here, and I look forward to hearing your comments today. Commissioner Hovland.
Thank you, Chairwoman McCormick. As the Chairwoman mentioned, this is our third hearing on the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines that are commonly referred to as VVSG 2.0. Previously, we'd had hearings in Memphis, Tennessee, and Salt Lake City. And in those meetings, we'd heard from state and local election officials, technology experts, accessibility advocates, voting system manufacturers, on the proposed principles and guidelines that make up the VVSG 2.0. Through this process, we've been reminded of the extensive work that has gone into getting us to this point, some of it even beginning prior to the restoration of the EAC quorum in 2015. I would again like to thank everyone who's worked on the VVSG 2.0 for the past several years. That work has brought us here where we can discuss the next generation of voluntary voting system guidelines. As we heard in our previous meetings, VVSG 2.0 is a significant step forward to modernize voting technology and move toward a system that aligns with other technology industry standards. We also discussed the voluntary nature of the VVSG and how it means that the value is only fully realized if these guidelines and the EAC's testing and certification program are utilized across the country. In other words, we should strive to create a VVSG product that is responsive to the needs of election officials and provides for access and security that the American voters deserve. We believe that an important part of achieving that goal has been to have an open process and to give all stakeholders an opportunity to weigh in on VVSG 2.0. As Commissioner McCormick mentioned, the public comment period is open until May 29th. We have received a number of comments, which we appreciate. We also know that there are procrastinators out there, and so we hope that you'll get your comments in before the 29th. And as for today's hearing, I look forward to hearing the testimony and would like to thank the witnesses for being here.
Commissioner Palmer, do you have comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the third hearing of 3 hearings that we've had on the VVSG 2.0. This really is the hard work of trying to fulfill the promise of bringing the next generation of voting systems to the United States and bringing the advances in technology that have taken place to the voting systems, to the voters, and to the election officials that serve them. And so we're having these hearings. Please provide input as you're able to. We want to make sure we get this right. We've always repair and replace things, but we want to make sure we get this right the first time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Commissioner Hicks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to thank you and the rest of the commissioners for having these 3 hearings. I think that we've done a decent job of going across the country, going from Memphis to Salt Lake and having one here in D.C. itself. When you and I started on the commission 4 years ago, we basically voted on 1.1, and I wanted to thank those folks who put that together when, in the absence of a quorum, that those folks being Brian Hancock, who was our first and only testing and certification director, who's now retired, Jessica Myers, who's now also away from the agency, and Ryan Macias, who's also away from the agency. And congratulate Jerome Votto, who is now our testing and certification director, because I know that there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do together. to move these forward. And I think that it's great for us to hear from the public itself, because this gives them an opportunity to actually give their input where other pieces of government regulations and so forth are not open for public comment like this. So they have until May 29th to get this done, and we've received, I believe, over 1,200 or so comments so far. And I'm looking forward to folks, as Commissioner Hovland said, the procrastinators out there to get their comments in within the next week or so. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. I'd like to welcome the Honorable Paul Pate, the Iowa Secretary of State. Secretary Pate is in his third term as Iowa's Commissioner of Elections. He served in the state Senate for 6 years, beginning in 1989, and was first elected Iowa's Secretary of State in 1994. Cedar Rapids voters selected him as their mayor in 2001. During that tenure, he also served as president of the Iowa League of Cities. Upon returning to the Secretary of State's office in 2015, 20 years after he was elected to that post for the first time, he set out to increase participation in Iowa elections by instituting online voter registration. More than 100,000 Iowans utilized the system in its first 3 years, and more than 250,000 newly registered voters joined the rolls by July of 2018. Secretary Pate's voter education efforts have been recognized nationally. The EAC awarded his office a 2019 Cleary Award for improving accessibility for voters with disabilities. The National Student Parent Mock Election Organization rewarded Secretary Pate with the Outstanding Leadership in Voter Education Award in 2016. On multiple occasions, Secretary Pate's youth straw polls have garnered more than 55,000 participants from more than 250 schools around Iowa. Secretary Pate is currently the president-elect of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and we look forward to hearing your testimony. Welcome, Secretary Pate.
Thank you, Chairwoman McCormick and Commissioners. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel and the public hearing on the adoptions of the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines 2.0. Although I'm here in my capacity as Iowa Secretary of State, I do want to point out that the National Association of Secretaries of State, of which I'm a member and the incoming president, has not taken a formal position on the process for approving the next iteration of the VVSG. Our Elections Committee is starting discussion later this month. My remarks today represent my role as Iowa Secretary of State and not NAS. I think it would be an understatement to say you have your work cut out for you. Frankly, in Iowa, we started out with reservations about working with the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. However, we were able to overcome those concerns and have formed a strong partnership with both the EAC and DHS. I want to thank the members of the EAC and the DHS for working with Iowa and the other states to protect the integrity of our elections. We've come a long way. I truly value these partnerships, and I look forward to working with you in the future. With the help from DHS and the EAC and other federal agencies, as well as our 99 county auditors and the numerous state agencies we partner with, our 2018 elections were secure. But we understand we must always be prepared and always keep in mind that election security is a race without a finish line. The VVSG 1.0, which most of the voting systems in the U.S. are certified to, were adopted before cybersecurity threats were our new normal. These new guidelines will take into account our new normal. Because election security is ever-changing, my guess is some of your new requirements will be old school soon after adopting and implementing them. Therefore, I would encourage you to take that into consideration when developing a process for future versions of this document. While state and local election officials, as well as manufacturers, are eager for the next version of the VVSG to be adopted, there has been some concern about the structure of the VVSG document and how quickly changes can be made to update the components of the VVSG as needed, especially in light of the unknown future cyber threats. Cyber threats are constantly evolving, and as state election officials, we must constantly evolve our methods of fighting these threats. As you know, when Commissioners Hovland and Palmer were sworn in February, it marked the first time in a decade that the EAC had a full quorum of commissioners. There is a concern from state officials when it comes to the VVSG that flexibility is a necessity, as is the ability to respond quickly to constantly evolving threats. I've read over the proposed VVSG 2.0 guidelines, and I agree with them. My concern comes with the requirements. We need to remember that elections are conducted by the states. We cannot allow state election officials to get bogged down in federal bureaucracy when it comes to combating cyber threats. Whatever requirements you decide to pass with the VVSG 2.0, please keep in mind that state election officials need flexibility and the ability to act quickly. We cannot wait weeks or months for a decision on the federal level when there's a need to act immediately. I'm asking all of you to have a dialogue about what happens if we run into that situation again where there is not a full quorum on the EAC. How will decisions be made, and will that make it more difficult for the state election officials to protect the security and the integrity of the vote? It's also vital that we have a clear and accurate timetable, as it will be important as we plan out future purchases of voting equipment, and we remember that accessibility of the equipment for all Americans is vital. In Iowa, we have made great strides to inform voters with disabilities about the resources available to them, including how to use accessible voting machines. Another issue comes to mind regarding timing. Just last spring, Congress fulfilled the last part of their commitment to fully fund the Help America Vote Act by providing the remaining $380 million to the states. We appreciate the speed and efficiency the EAC used to disperse those funds. Many states plan to use those funds to purchase new equipment. However, I would imagine that they would like to purchase systems that have been certified to the VVSG 2.0, which means there will be a delay. Unfortunately, there is a time limit on spending those HAVA funds, and we may not have new equipment certified by then. As you start to finalize the requirements and test assertions, I encourage you to keep involving the manufacturers, testing labs, and election officials in the writing of those requirements. It is my understanding that in 2005, these stakeholders were not working together when requirements were developed, and there were long delays because equipment failed to meet testing requirements. Involving the stakeholders in the formation of the requirements and test assertions is a smart move. As Iowa Secretary of State, I will be asking Congress to assist the election community by 1, assuring that the EAC will be fully staffed and adequately funded, 2, working to assure that EAC maintains a continuous quorum, and 3, finding ways and resources to bring additional testing labs into the election space. I understand there are only 2 accredited testing labs, and there was a time period when there was only 1 lab. With that, I again want to thank the EAC for its partnership and dedication to ensure clean, fair elections across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Pate. Could I ask you what the situation is with the voting systems in Iowa? What kind of systems do you use?
We are a paper ballot state, and we have 3 primary vendors who do most of the jurisdictions in our area. Most of our counties have updated their systems in the last 3 years. Our larger counties are just in the process of doing their updates, and they are the ones who have expressed to us, that they'd like not to have a surprise if it changes dramatically. We were fortunate before that because we didn't try anything really dramatic, we stayed with paper ballots. We didn't face a lot of those changes with whatever came out of the standards that were developed before. So we're optimistic we'll still be in that situation.
So the counties that are looking at buying systems now, when do they expect to buy those systems by the 2020 presidential election?
Most of them, yes.
Yeah. And how do you fund your systems in Iowa?
The local county jurisdictions pay for them.
So the state doesn't
No, state
donate
does
any
not.
money? Okay, so but the federal government has, of course, through the HAVA money, provided some funding. And has that been distributed to the states then for that purpose? Or
It
to
did-
the counties for that
It
purpose?
did for the initial HAVA funding. The second wave has been put into the cybersecurity side, so all the updates for the counties, cyber navigators, other support mechanisms is where we prioritize those monies right now. So that service has gone to the counties, putting in the malware, the various filtering systems. Well, that's where that priority has been put.
And how confident are you that the systems that you're using right now are secure?
We're very confident because, as it was pointed out, we're using paper ballots. We have
The scan?
scan.
Yeah.
We have the post-election audits, and we have local people serving as poll watchers and that process. So we put a lot of significant safeguards in on the actual voting process.
Thank you. Commissioner Hovland, do you have questions?
Thank you. Secretary Pate, I appreciate you being here and your testimony. One question I'd want to ask you in particular, because of your experience being a secretary before and after HAVA, certainly we're all appreciate the role that we play in federalism and how the states run elections, but given that, at least I'll speak for myself, I believe that testing and certification and the VVSG are a real opportunity for economies of scale and to really save taxpayer dollars ultimately and to benefit from having a uniform system, but as I said, one that states embrace. And so I didn't know if you could comment at all about your experience, again, as a secretary before there was an EAC and after, and my understanding of the history of the VVSG is that for a while it was that the FEC and certainly NASED had engaged in a consortium to work on voting system standards.
Certainly. I would say that we support the approach we're taking right now and trying to set standards and have an EAC play a key role in that. I think it's a good fit. Clearly, my first round, as I call it, Pate 1.0, we were not faced with the intensity of the cyber situation. We always were faced with ballot security, so we had to address it from that standpoint. But with this new norm, if you will, of intensity of the cyber situation, we have some pretty pricey investments to make, and we want to make sure we're making them wisely with the taxpayer dollars, so we're not having to repeat something in 3 years and having to spend millions of more dollars. So that's part of the caution we put into this process. But I think the EAC's role on helping us with setting those testing standards up and helping get the labs in place, I think is something we would value.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Palmer, do you have questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary Pate, for being with us today. We appreciate it. In Iowa, what are the accessible equipment that's used?
We have a complete list, and I'd be happy to send it over to you. We have, like I said, 3 primary vendors, I'm thinking right now. The counties pretty much are the ones that deal with the vendors directly. Our office has played a role in which we will assist the counties in setting up what their expectations should be. And now with the EAC stepping in and helping us more with the testing and certification of the systems, we think that'll create a lot more continuity and assurances that we're not having to spend money over and over, as I said earlier. And I think the vendors have indicated that to us. They want to see that as well. Between that and our work with e-poll books, those 2 components are big ones for us in the election arena, and they're expensive. So that'll help us.
So in a previous question, you mentioned that the localities handle the funding of most of their voting systems.
Correct.
On the federal level, if there were funds that were appropriated for tied to 2.0 or provided to Iowa, is that something that there could be a partnership with the state? Is that a state legislative issue that?
Certainly. Well, as we did at the first round of HAVA's monies, those monies did go to the counties. There was a formula designed and it was sent there. If that were to happen again, well, certainly. And in fact, even with this last round, when we looked at the amount of money and looking at the priorities, it was more focused directly on cyber, and we knew we needed to get the various malware and support staff, and a lot of these counties are so small they don't have an IT resource, so we serve as that hub, if you will, for them. So the priority then was for that particular approach. But going forward, certainly if the federal dollars were there and they were significant enough, that money would definitely go to help the counties, because that's where the big lift is for dollars.
My last question is on the principles and guidelines themselves. If you've had a chance to look at them, what are some of the principles that you are sort of most focused on, and we should be sort of focusing our efforts on?
Well, I thought the document was very articulately written, but it's like they say, the devil's in the details. Okay, there's a lot of interpretive language in there. What does that mean now as you go to the next level? So as a document, was nothing there I couldn't support. I thought it was very well written in that sense. But as I pointed out in my remarks, what's the dialogue about, as I mentioned, if there's a transition on an EAC commission and you don't have the members? How would you approach that? How would you deal with some of the other things that come up that are timely issues? You know, is the commission prepared and ready to be able to respond and act on that? Or do they need staff support for some of those things? So I want to make sure you've had that dialogue, and if you can share with us the kind of the plan of action, I think it would help a lot of people. I'm not here to represent NASED, but I know there's a lot of those election folks who had some concern about wanting to know, will you be able to respond quick enough to what's going on? And that's probably the question mark. It's not in what you wrote today, it's what we're writing in the details of the document. So, all right.
Thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Commissioner Hicks?
Thank you, Honorable Secretary Paul Pate. Thank you for coming in to give us your thoughts on this, and I know that it must be a hard time there now with so many folks coming into your state right now for various reasons. When you mentioned that the state, the locals pay for the voting equipment, something clicked in my head on that. So the state doesn't pay any amount of money to the state, to the locals to fund any of the equipment at all?
No, they don't. The exception, as I pointed out, was when the major HAVA funding came in some time back. That was a formula that was set up, and a significant amount of the money went to the counties to help move to that upgrade. We've been very fortunate that the counties, having done that, saw the importance of keeping their equipment updated and have built it into their budgets. Each state's different on how they handle elections. Some states subsidize and pay directly for those kinds of expenses. Others let the local jurisdictions fund it, and that's where we're at right now. We have discussed with the legislature as certain new components are coming along, particularly on the cyber side. We have been putting more and more in our budget. As I mentioned, almost all the cyber training and all the support systems that you need for that are being covered by the state at this time.
So the support, so does that mean actual people going into?
Yes.
Okay.
Staff going in, we will set up their whatever systems they need, partnering with our own state OCIO office and our own office. And we just hired an additional cyber navigator who is their county point person to help them with all the details.
Okay. And so my last question is sort of just for my own edification. In terms of the match, the 5% match from the $380 million that Congress appropriated, did any of that money come from the locals, or was that all state money? That 5% match, was that all state money, or was
It was all state money.
Okay, that's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. I just have one follow-up question. The counties who are buying equipment by 2020, so will you, the other equipment that isn't being purchased by
Right.
2020, how old is the oldest piece of equipment that's being used, and when do you foresee those pieces of equipment being replaced?
I would say the oldest would have been the last round of HAVA funding, because everybody replaced their systems during that period. As I said, the larger counties have been holding back the longest because they have a lot more money to spend to get there. But typically, I can use one county, who's one of our larger counties. It was about, I'm trying to think what they told me now. I'll stand corrected. I won't give the number out because then I'll get corrected later. But the point is they have internally planned for it and have all updated theirs. So the oldest would be probably 10 years, 15 years old, in that range. But again, the equipment itself, doing paper ballots, it isn't really all worn out. It's just a case of, good maintenance. You need to rotate it out and bring in new. The e-poll books is probably our biggest county expenses, and those are running anywhere about $1,500 per voting per unit, and you have 3 to 4 of those at a voting site. So those are probably the biggest expenses counties are incurring.
Well, thank you very
Madam
much
Chair,
for your testimony. You
I
have another question?
Just
Okay.
one more question.
Okay.
It just occurred to me. On Friday, we went to see the National Disability for of the Blind, the National Federation of the Blind. They had a quick conference for us, a conference. And one of the things that you had mentioned was about additional labs. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this concept that was raised. The issue that some of the labs are having with joining this space is that it's too encumbered, so that they can't do everything that is asked in that particular. They might not have the expertise to do some of these things. So one of the thoughts that was thrown out was to have separate labs in different parts to do different pieces of it, because and the disability folks were saying that some of the labs are not really great at testing their machines towards the disability issues of it. But I just wanted to know what your thoughts are to basically, have someone who could do the disability testing in one area, or, penetration in another, or whatever else.
Well, I think that whatever we have to do to be able to have greater access and more faster response, I think we'd want to entertain those options, as long as those labs clearly are embracing and understand what the elections game is all about. I think we'd welcome those opportunities. All options should be on the table, I guess is a polite way to put it, because when we only had the one lab, clearly that wasn't enough if you want to see this move along at a good response time. So the more we can have join this, I think the better.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions, commissioners?
All right.
Thank you, Secretary
you.
Pate. We so much appreciate your testimony and for being here today. So I will call up the second panel, our panel of technical experts. Tracy Mapps from SLI, Jack Cobb from Pro B&V, and Joseph Lorenzo Hall from the Center for Democracy and Technology. So welcome to our second panel. Appreciate you all being here. I'm going to start with Joseph Lorenzo Hall, Chief Technologist and Director of the Internet Architecture Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Joseph Lorenzo Hall is the Chief Technologist and Director of the Internet Architecture Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring the Internet remains open, innovative, and free. Hall's work focuses on the intersection of technology, law, and policy, working to ensure that technical considerations are appropriately embedded into legal and policy instruments. Though he supports work across all of CDT's programmatic areas, Mr. Hall leads CDT's Internet Architecture Project, which focuses on embedding human rights values into core Internet standards and infrastructure, engaging technologists in policy work, and producing accessible technical material for policymakers. Mr. Hall received his PhD in Information Systems from the UC Berkeley School of Information, and his PhD thesis used electronic voting as a critical case study in digital government transparency. In his postdoctoral work, he developed techniques to increase the efficiency and usability of accountability mechanisms in electronic elections. Mr. Hall has served as an expert on independent teams invited by the states of California, Ohio, and Maryland to analyze legal, privacy, security, usability, and economic aspects of voting systems. He is the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the California Voter Foundation, a member of the Board of Directors of the Verified Voting Foundation, and a member of the Federal Communications Commission's Computer Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, CSRIC-4. Welcome, Mr. Hall.
Thank you. I'm going to shorten that. I apologize.
That's fine. Thank you.
Chairwoman McCormick, Vice Chair Hovland, Commissioner Hicks, Commissioner Palmer, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Joseph Lorenzo Hall. I'm going to skip all that because you did it. As I note in my written testimony, I've been involved with voting system standards since about 2004, authoring the public comments of the National Science Foundation's Accurate Center. Today I'm going to talk a bit about our perspective in CDT about some of the most important issues in the VVSG 2.0 process. First, principles versus requirements. We are all so heartened to see the EAC with a full slate of commissioners and, crucially, a quorum with which to conduct regular business. The most critical aspect of developing and adopting the VVSG 2.0 is the need to design it to be flexible and agile, even when a quorum doesn't exist. If past voting system standard efforts are any indication, the number of requirements are going to be large. Voting systems are complex systems. Any flexibility and adaptability of this new system will be lost if EAC commissioners have to vote on more than just a handful of requirements. We suggest that the EAC define a separate process that outlines ongoing and regular public comment for VVSG requirements and a mechanism for members of the TGDC and the EAC to flag specific requirements that might require commission deliberation, discussion, or even a vote. Second, transitioning between the VVSG testing regimes. A voting system testing standard does not provide much assurance if systems can be certified against vastly outdated standards developed many years ago. The new two-level structure, having principles and requirements, will allow the requirements to evolve in time. But in order for the underlying systems to also evolve, the testing and certification program must set some hard boundaries. We would like to move away from monolithic standards and whole system submission, as we've been discussing. A potential first move in this direction would be something like requiring manufacturers to commit to a snapshot, sort of a subset of VVSG requirements, and be allowed to be tested against those requirements or any newer snapshot for a period of 5 years. This would allow manufacturers to target a certain stable subset of requirements necessary to field a whole election system, but would require and encourage them to move to a more recent snapshot within 5 years. This is just one candidate proposal, and we encourage the EAC to solicit more ideas here, potentially, for example, in the form of a joint workshop with NIST on designing evolving voting system standards. Third, adversarial testing and vulnerability handling. Voting systems should be tested by dedicated computer and network security experts using adversarial testing methods, something we call penetration testing, where an operational version of the system is attacked by an expert team trying to find bugs, flaws, and vulnerabilities. These kinds of penetration testing efforts will inevitably find issues, and each voting system manufacturer must have an effective vulnerability handling process and a standard vulnerability reporting mechanism in place. There are existing international standards under ISO for exactly these kinds of things. In addition, the EAC should consider hiring a security testing program evaluator that could assess the quality of security testing at current voting system testing laboratories and potentially require them to hire outside penetration testing and security evaluation firms to fulfill this aspect of testing. Fourth and finally, there are a number of critical areas that exist outside the scope of the VVSG. The EAC should explore extending its authority to encompass subsystems that may be commonly used with certified voting systems, even if those subsystems may not be strictly within the definition of a voting system. Unfortunately, if something is classified as an accessory to a certified voting system, but that accessory can cause the voting system to fail, that accessory should properly be defined as part of the larger voting system. We see this in the most, very prominently in the case of electronic poll books. So electronic poll books are becoming a standard feature of modern polling places. They improve the voter check and flow and experience. They make vote centers possible at all. And however, they can have pretty complex interactions with network resources. For example, when used in a vote center deployment, electronic poll books need to communicate with the central database to be able to prevent voters from being able to vote twice in different vote centers. We've seen some examples of these failing and unfortunately causing voters to be unable to vote for a long period of time. I've got other stuff, but I'll just say thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Commissioner Hovland, do you have questions? You want questions at the end? Okay, we'll do that. So I want to welcome Tracy Mapps, from Director of Operations from SLA Compliance. Ms. Mapps is a highly experienced executive-level leader of test labs and test operations with more than 11 years in the voting industry managing voting test teams and over 20 years of experience managing multi-million-dollar test facilities. Ms. Mapps serves as Director for SLI Compliance, where she manages the all day-to-day operation of 2 certified test labs. SLI Compliance is both a voting system test lab, VISTL, accredited by U.S. Election Assistance Commission, as well as an ONC authorized test lab, ONC ATL, and an authorized certification body, ONC ACB, by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of the National Coordinator. Ms. Mapps is respected throughout the voting test certification community as a thought leader and was the primary architect of SLI Compliance's Advanced Voting System Protocol, which represents a state-of-the-art test solution for elections and voting systems industry. She has managed dozens of voting system certification projects for state governments and the EAC using technology that ranged from optical scanning to internet-based systems. Ms. Mapps is a certified quality engineer, certified software quality engineer, and an IST QB certified tester foundation level. Welcome, Ms. Mapps.
Thank you. I can also skip my first part. And I'm going to say, I'm sorry, I have a horrible sore throat, so I'm going to try to get through this without coughing or anything else. Good afternoon, Chairwoman McCormick, and Commissioners. I'd like to thank all of you for having me here today. As you know, I'm going to skip through here just a little bit. SLI has been an independent test authority for voting system certification testing since the NACID first established a certification program in 2001 for voting system certification. We employ a long tenured experienced team of credentialed voting system test and security professionals, and we have experience with nearly every voting system being used in the U.S. today. To date, we have been authorized to conduct certification testing across the VSS and VVSG standards, and we have completed a number of VAC test certification engagements across all of these standards, with the exception of VVSG 1.1, which no voting system has been tested to as of yet. Not only does SLI perform federal certification testing under the EAC, but we also provide security and certification testing services directly to several states. SLI also participates in the Department of Homeland Security's Sector Coordinating Council, SCC, for the election infrastructure subsector. Federal certification testing includes testing of all the existing 1,000 plus requirements that include functional testing, usability and accessibility, hardware, software analysis, telecommunications, security, quality assurance and configuration management audits, and more. Based on this, I feel that SLI and ProVMV have an unmatched expertise when it comes to voting system standards and the understanding of testing systems to these standards for certification. With the 2 public hearings that have already taken place before this one, you've already received much input and feedback from the election community. I appreciate you inviting me here today to provide a statement in regard to the proposed VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines from a VISTL standpoint. Since SLI has not seen any of the requirements or test assertions that have been developed for VVSG 2.0, I'll provide you with my thoughts on the proposed principles and guidelines at this time. As we all know and have heard throughout the previous public hearings, it is imperative to get certified voting systems to the field as quickly as possible in a manner that doesn't impose unnecessary cost. With that, I cannot stress enough the importance of having standards that are as unambiguous as possible to accommodate these needs. For VVSG 1.0, there have been over 20 requests for interpretation that were open due to the ambiguity of many of the requirements. This is a very tedious and time-consuming effort that involves both parties from both labs, the manufacturers and the EACs, and can hinder the process of getting voting systems through the test and certification program in an efficient and timely manner. Having standards that are clear and as precise as possible also prevents inconsistencies in testing among the VSTLs. I more than appreciate the time and energy that has gone into developing the proposed VVSG 2.0 policies and guidelines, but I would like to respectfully request that modifications be considered to reduce the ambiguity in the manner that these have been written. I certainly understand that the principles and guidelines are to provide high-level system design goals, and the guidelines are to provide a broad description of the functions that make up a voting system. But in my opinion, there needs to be some level of specification in order to write the requirements and test assertions. As I said earlier, SLI has not seen the requirements that have been developed to date, and perhaps they have been written in a way that addresses the ambiguities in the principles and guidelines, but it's hard to say without having seen the requirements or the test assertions. In the past versions of the standards, ambiguity has been an issue. In addition, if my understanding is correct, the requirements are to contain the technical details for manufacturers to design their voting systems, and the test assertions are supposed to contain technical specifications needed by the labs to test the voting systems against the requirements. If this is the case, I feel it is important to have early communications with the VISTLs regarding the development of the requirements and test assertions. Perhaps most importantly, the test assertions. SLI was asked to assist with the development of test assertions for VVSG 1.0 2005. We were very involved with the creation of test assertions written to address ambiguities that were realized after implementation. We have not participated in developing test assertions for VVSG 2.0, which is a bit concerning Considering that the primary reason for developing test assertions is to assist the test labs, I feel the assistance that SLI provided in the past was very valuable. Once again, I appreciate the opportunity to provide a statement today. I feel that the development of the VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines, along with the requirements and test assertions, must be done right the first time. I believe we have had plenty of opportunity to learn what has worked well and what has not. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do feel that precise principles, guidelines, and requirements will help to make this next round of standards more effective and prevent needless inefficiencies. I more than appreciate you listening to my feedback, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Mabs.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it. Mr. Cobb. Jack Cobb is co-founder and laboratory director of ProV&V. ProV&V, Inc. is a National Institute of Standards and Technology accredited National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation NVLAP Voting Systems Test Laboratory located in Huntsville, Alabama, and is an EAC accredited voting systems test laboratory. Mr. Cobb has over 18 years of development and test experience with a solid background in software application development and implementation using object-oriented analysis and design. He provides technical expertise and guidance to several entities in the voting systems test arena, including federal and state certification bodies and voting system manufacturers, and is accepted by the voting systems industry as a subject matter expert in voting systems and voting systems test and certification. He's currently serving as SME/examiner to multiple states' election bodies, providing technical guidance and expertise for the examination and re-examination of electronic voting systems to federal and state requirements. Welcome, Mr. Cobb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioners. I'm honored to have this opportunity to be here today. I thank you for extending me the invitation to come and discuss this important topic. I would like to begin by stating that I have participated in many panels and testified at a few public hearings, but for the first time, I believe that I am in the presence of a full slate of commissioners at the EAC Election Assistance Commission. And it's good to see that, and I hope it stays that way. Some 5 years ago, stakeholders in this industry were in a much different place. At this time, the commission did not have a single commissioner, much less a quorum. There had not been a commissioner since December of 2011. The standards last adopted by the EAC Commission was the 2005 EAC VVSG. NIST had written the next iteration, or what became 2007 VVSG. They had completed updating VVSG 1.1, but nothing could be done because the standards had to be voted on by the EAC per the 2002 Help America Vote Act. I do not believe that when HAVA was adopted by Congress, they thought there would ever be a time where there were no commissioners. Well, that did occur, and the amount of time that went on was measured in years, not months. Updating the standards was not a slow process or the adoption was taking too long. It was simply we had to work with the standards that were set in time, and we could not update those because there was no quorum of commissioners. With this reality, stakeholders started to really look at making the process of adopting, modifying, and testing two standards more agile. Also, meetings were being held and discussions were being had not only about the process, but also about the content. The main question about the standard was, do we want a design standard or a high-level guideline that allows for technology to solve problems as it advances? These meetings and discussions went on for about a year, and it was determined that in order to develop a voting system as modern as technology allows, that we should move to a more high-level group of principles that do not take into consideration current technologies. The new VVSG 2.0 that we are discussing here today was developed to be the standard that once adopted, it would stand for a long period of time without need of modification because as technology changes and security postures change, it would account for this. This standard is laid out with 15 major principles that a voting system must meet to ensure the reliability and integrity of American elections. Again, I'd like to thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners, for allowing me to speak on this important topic, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cobb. Commissioner Hovland.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony and for being here. Since you have all had a lot of experience with VVSG 1.0 and this process, I wondered, and this is for everyone on the panel, if you could comment about, I guess, first of all, if VVSG 2.0 looks more in line with other industry standards, or particularly in technology industry standards? And then number two, what you see as the significant changes between particularly 1.0 and 2.0?
As you read earlier, we are also a accredited test lab under the ONC. We work as a certification body under the ONC as well. And looking at they don't necessarily have principles and guidelines. They have rules that they follow, which could be aligned with the principles and guidelines. I think that they're much more detailed. They are the rules that we look at right now that have been addressed by the ONC are approximately 800 pages. I'm not saying that that's where they need to go, but as a comparison, 800 pages versus 8 is quite a difference. I think that trying to find a balance in how we specify or have specifications in the principles and guidelines is important. I think that if I were to write the requirements based on the current principles and guidelines, it would be hard for me to do. When you have statements like robustly and gracefully, terms like clear, I don't know what those things mean, or I know what they mean to me, I guess, but they may be different to Joseph or to Jack that's sitting next to me. And so writing requirements could be a difficult process. I think that in other industries that I've worked under, they're a bit more detailed and precise than what I see in the principles and guidelines today.
I don't have direct experience with other industries. I've researched some things that we're trying to move towards. And kind of the way I see it is that if there's something that has been legislated or there is a requirement legally to create something, that those areas try to stay at a higher level, and then the devil's in the details on somewhere else that's not legally mandated that you have to have that.
Yeah, excuse me. So I'll add a little bit. I don't have bench experience as these two folks have with actually testing voting systems. And so the things that I do, for example, web standards or internet standards, you'll have a 120-page document just about one particular communication mechanism, right? And so I guess, I'm sort of agreeing with both Tracy and Jack here in saying that when we need something that's sort of like, as I put in my written testimony, sort of a constitutional document for the voting system standards, something that it's principles. They're not things that engineers can necessarily reduce to something you could test a system to, but then the requirements in the testing assertion process should be able to come in and do that. We definitely need to look out for words like gracefully and robustly, because those don't mean anything to engineers. I mean, they mean something to me, looking at other aspects of my life, but not what a machine would do. So it may be good to actually specify what that means technically. I don't think that necessarily needs to be in the principles and guidelines, but that's the first step you'd want to take to reducing them to requirements and test assertions.
Thank you. We've received, we've received a lot of comments about wireless technology and its inclusion. Obviously, that's a fairly controversial topic, but Dr. Hall, can you comment if you think that addressing wireless technology would be more appropriate as a principle and guideline or as a requirement, particularly recognizing that wireless may be appropriate for certain systems like accessible systems or other things, but may be inappropriate in the context of a tabulator or something like that?
Yeah, so let me think about this for a sec. Wireless could be many different kinds of things, and so it would be, I think, inappropriate to ban it or mention it otherwise in the principles and guidelines. For example, I'm going to get nerdy for a sec. The Ivotronic and ES&S system uses infrared communication between this brick you put in it and the machine itself, and it does it over a very tiny little distance. And so some people don't think is that effectively wireless, even though it's infrared? Anyway, so we need to be careful how we define these things. I think what people are probably thinking about when they send these comments in, I haven't seen them, are wireless transmission of voted ballot data for example. Obviously, transmissions can be of any kind of election information, be it communications with a database about an e-poll book that's not necessarily about voted data. And we care a lot more about the type of wireless transmission when the underlying information is particularly sensitive. And there's a ton of different best practice for doing those things. But again, at the level that the principles and guidelines are set now, it doesn't seem like you can just say anything about some large concept such as wireless. And so I would recommend that that be broken out more in principles and guidelines.
Or down in the requirements.
Sorry, that's what I meant, requirements. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. Commissioner Palmer, do you have questions for the panel?
Yes. Thank you. Dr. Hall, a couple of questions on, it really is for everybody. This is a broad question. There was a lot of discussion about flexibility and agility with requirements. As you know, a lot of states have requirements. They also do testing in labs. But in HAVA, we have, depending on how you interpret it, we have requirements that need to go through a process with other stakeholders, like the Board of Advisors, the not the VVSG, the TGDC, excuse me, and the Standards Board. So, but because you have experience on the ground, particularly, what do you mean by, what do you see as ways to get more flexibility and agility? I mean, from my perspective as a director of elections in Florida, for example, there have to be deadlines. That means there's deadlines and there's limits, there's timelines that you must meet. We want to make sure we get this right, but what can we do as a commission or commissioners to make sure that if someone wants to bring in a system, we can make sure that it's done quickly and in a limited period of time? So I'll just open that up for everybody.
So I'll take the first shot at it. So basically, the process of creating the standards has got to go through the whole HAVA situation. But if we had something underlying that the community and all the stakeholders could agree, just for instance, we can say like a voting system has to be accurate. Okay, we can say that we're going to run the current 1.0 to 1.5 million ballot positions. But if everybody's in agreement that that's not enough or that may be too much, we could easily change the assertion and no one has to touch the standard. The standard still, it's got to be accurate. So talking about agility and speed, if we've got to go to the standards board, and then we've got to have public comment, and then we've got to go to the board of advisors, and we've got to have public comment, and then we have to have 3 public meetings for public comment, I can't get that changed. It still says I've got to do 1.5 million ballot positions. I've got to wait years to get that changed. And so what we're trying to say, or I'm trying to say, I'm not going to put words in Joe's mouth, but what I'm trying to say is the ability for us to either increase testing or decrease testing is not part of that process. It's part of a different process. It's not part of adopting a standard. The standard is it's got to be accurate. And by saying it's accurate today or saying it's secure today, it may not be the same in 10 years when this document may still be being tested to, just like we're doing 14 years after the adoption of 2005. We're still testing to that. But all of those things are written in stone from the last time they were adopted or 1/1 when it's adopted. But if you go to a higher level, you can adjust the stuff below it as best practices change and as the industry changes.
With that, I don't know, I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do like Joseph's idea of having a subset of the requirements that maybe need to be approved by the commissioners if there are changes made to those. I think that there are some that are so critical and so important that you have to be careful in making modifications to those.
Excuse me, when you say standards, do you mean requirements?
Requirements,
Okay.
sorry.
Just want to make sure.
Yep. I think that there's some that you don't necessarily need approval at the commissioner level to make modifications to, but I think that there are some that should be addressed at a higher level. And that's just my opinion. I also feel like you need to understand if we decide to make these changes just willy-nilly, making changes to assertions or to the requirements, there's got to be a policy around that. And so it's hard for me to buy into either approval or not approval without understanding what those policies might be. writing test methods, test procedures, all of that. Validating those before we can do the testing is an important a part of the process in certification testing. And so depending on how quickly these are changed, we've got to be able to do stuff on the back end to make sure the testing is done correctly and accurately as well. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but it's
getting there.
comment. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the challenge that we all face here is that we want to make sure that we can point to this system meets some bar. And you want to be able to point to that bar and say, I know what that bar is, right? The trick is what we also need to be able to do is allow that sort of bar, that sort of level of agreement to change in certain ways that aren't held up by the heavy-duty process that HAVA puts in front of us. And so, for example, there's a bunch of the requirements that are not going to be typically interesting or controversial or whatever, but they could use updating, like, millions of ballot positions, or even aspects of the shake and bake testing, that we shock it with a lightning bolt kind of stuff. That stuff doesn't change nearly as much as, for example, cybersecurity requirements for testing have changed in the past 10 years. They've changed like night and day. If you did them back then and you woke up now, you'd be like, wow, this is a very different world, right? And so there are some of these things that need to be particularly more flexible than others even. And this is why I think it makes sense to think of a process. And I outlined a very sketchy process. We literally just thought up something that would both allow things to be updated, but would also encourage manufacturers to move as quickly they could to more recent versions of these things, of the requirements. And so in this kind of a model, which sure people might find holes in, you would try to find a continuous process for updating the requirements. And so that would at least allow folks to propose new ideas, have them vetted. If someone thinks, hey, this needs to have a more fulsome discussion, it should be something brought in front of you guys, or maybe you don't need to see all of them. And now I'm hand waving because I need to actually sit down and do the engineering of how all that would work. But it seems like something like that had sort of it wasn't we throw these standards over the wall, yay, we're done, but slowly improve them over time, but included a mechanism to allow manufacturers to think, hey, that one's going to be a requirement soon. We can do that now. Why don't we just do that now? And when it becomes a requirement, we're already meeting it, right? Rather than, oh, geez, let's wait till it comes over the wall and not do anything until that happens, which is the problem we face now.
Now, you made a statement, Dr. Hall, that you couldn't envision voting on more than a handful of requirements by commissioners. Why do you hold that position?
Well, I mean, if they're going to be thousands, you're going to have to take them in batches, or you're going to have to read each and every one of them. And I don't think you may, but we should hang out if you do. If you want to get down in the weeds of these requirements, it requires a ton of extra information, a ton of extra, and I'm not saying you're not up to it, I'm just saying you probably have better things to do with your time, and that's why we have staff and TGDC and the boards of advisors and standards to help assist this process. And rather than seeing them as steps in the road to getting it done, we can see them as steps to helping make sure that this is I was going to use the word robust, but I won't do that. Make sure that these things work really well.
So, Dr. Hall, you made in your testimony, you talked about manufacturers may be required, for example, to commit to a dated snapshot, a subset of VVSG requirements, for example, all approved requirements for precinct-based optical scanning. So let's say they did that. Let's say that was some sort of policy, and a system was tested, certified, deployed. Would that mean that the manufacturer would be required to update that firmware in 5 years, for example, for certain? Is that what you're envisioning?
Yeah.
And what if they're not available? Is it
If they,
decertified? I mean,
if
what?
they didn't, in the sketch that we outlined, if they didn't do anything in those 5 years, they would suddenly meet a really high bar, which is whatever the requirements changed between when they started testing to when that 5-year period came up. And so the kind of sleight of hand here is that you encourage them to certify to newer requirements as they're coming out, so that they build in this notion of, oh, geez, even our systems are changing continuously, so we need to test them to continually changing requirements.
Any?
And feel free to say I'm crazy.
I'd like just to add something to that. Also, with what he's saying is like right now we adopt 1.1, and I know y'all have heard quite a bit from manufacturers about, oh my gosh, we can't go to 1.1, or when are you going to do 2.0 because we've got this heavy lift to get to where we're in compliance with these massive changes in standards. And you're not changing one or two or one this month and one next month and then one 2 months from now. You're doing them all at one time. It also probably would be very beneficial to the manufacturers to update a little at a time instead of having all of them thrown over the wall, as he said, and then they have to meet that bar as soon as y'all sunset something, or if that happens. You've got to meet all 1,500 requirements instead of, yeah, I met that one last time I did this, and I'm going to meet the next one the next time I'm going to do this. And by the time 5 years goes down, I already meet that because I've been doing it incrementally as we go.
I think that's interesting. I just keep hearing new things. I think I have a thought on how it should be, and then you hear something different. Yeah, I don't know. I think that, with all the security type issues that have been brought up, maybe looking at that as a subset that we look at having manufacturers certify to in a new version. I don't know. I mean, that seems to be talk of the town, the most important kind of area right now. And so maybe instead of across the board updating and certifying to all of the new requirements, maybe you look at a subset that they start out with and it's a phased approach. That's not a bad idea.
Areas that we know are going to change.
I have a few more questions, but I'll let Tom go.
Commissioner Hicks.
Thank you. I have a few questions. You guys have opened my eyes to a few things that I'm still trying to comprehend here. One, it seems like there's two different paths that are being thought of for the requirements. One, that the commission should turn some of that over to staff because it might be too voluminous. And the second seems that turn it over to staff just in case there's not a quorum, is what I'm hearing. I have issues with both those to certain degrees, but I just want to make sure that that's exactly what I heard today. So, yes, everyone's nodding their head yes, because I can't go on it has to be vocal. Just like the emergency exits. You have to say yes or no. Tracy, Ms. Mapps, you had said something about the test assertions. That you had worked on those before. Were those voted on before or after the final commission vote when you worked on them?
The requirements or the test
The
assertions?
test assertions.
The test assertions, I guess I'm not even certain that there was a vote on the test assertions.
Because my understanding is that they're not voted on, but they come after the final
They
vote.
came after the final
Okay.
vote. They were not developed until after the VVSG 1.0 was implemented. And my understanding and what I recall from that time frame is that it was due to all of the way that the requirements were written, that there was so much ambiguity that there needed to be some clarification, and so the test assertions were written. It was also to help with inconsistencies in the way that things were tested at the test labs because of those ambiguities. There were so many RFIs that were written, and there was the thought that test assertions would help. And so if I can say one other thing, to me, writing test assertions now, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with that, because if the requirements are written specifically and precisely enough, I don't know what the need is for test assertions unless they're really going to be kind of a test procedure for the test labs to follow. Test assertions in the past were written because of the ambiguity.
Just a couple more questions. How are standards written in other industries? Particularly, I'm thinking of the auto industry, because the car that you drove in 1980 is not the car that you're driving in 2019. And so those standards have changed over time. Do any of you know how those are written and dealt with? You can say no. It just occurred to me.
I know a very little bit about it. I could tell you what I do know.
Okay.
For example, the Federal Motor Vehicle System, Federal Motor Vehicle FV FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle System Standards, are, I would say, similar in the sense that, and I may have to take this for the record, but essentially you publish things like cars must provide this kind of capability by this date, and there's a lot of wrangling about that. But those are pretty high level. They can be somewhat detailed. For example, there's been a whole lot of attention to vehicle-to-vehicle communication standards, and that's definitely, wireless radio communication between your car and another car and your car and infrastructure.
That's where I was particularly getting at, because I keep hearing about we should ban wireless, but there were, I guess, tests done a few years ago where cars were being hacked and so forth, and people were being able to control the speed or braking and in that sort of realm. But we're not talking about banning wireless on cars and so forth. But
No, yeah.
but I get the argument.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, the vehicle-to-vehicle standard, for example, was quietly pulled after a bunch of people in the industry and academics basically pointed out a bunch of flaws in basically it's not 3 pages, but a very short document that basically, when we did the math around it, it proved that, for example, you could track 100,000 cars with a laptop in real time around you, which is sort of not the world that we want to live in. And I think the administration agreed and pulled those. But it happens very differently in different areas, and it depends on, like, the ONC situation with HHS is particularly interesting, because that is a set where they have sort of a set of legal requirements, so to speak. Like, anyway, now I'm just rambling. You don't want to hear me.
Yeah. So go on.
If I can add on to that with the ONC, something that's a bit different is that NIST NavLab actually writes the test procedures that are handed down to the test labs. And so they don't have test assertions per se, but they actually write the test procedures. So the labs do not validate methods, their own methods that they have written themselves. They're using the ones that are handed down from the ONC to make sure that the testing is done very consistently.
Yeah, maybe that's something we can ask NIST to do for our pass-through. So, but the last question I have, I threw this out to Secretary Pate earlier in terms of the way that labs are formulated now. And Jack, I know that one of the first things that we did when we became reconstituted was to vote for your lab to be certified. But the way that I'm hearing about labs more and more is, this is not a large industry. It's very secular, but it's also there's some things that need to be taken care of that everyone can't do at once. So you might have the experts on this, and another lab might have the experts on that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on opening it up the thought of labs to do other aspects of it, not necessarily one that are controlled by the government or the federal government overall, but just more of expanding it out for other people to do those sorts of tests.
Well, the voting system and test industry is multidiscipline. You have to have people who can read source code, for instance. That's one set of skills. But then you have to have someone who knows about usability, someone who knows about accessibility, somebody who knows something about documentation and how to read documentation. The guy who reads code might not be the best document person. So you have to have all these disciplines, and there are skill sets that are very specific. You brought up security. Well, those things can be done by a third-party lab, not required to be done by the VSTL. Currently, it is written that the VSTL will be the primary lead laboratory. So when we go to hardware testing, I fly my guys to Longmont, Colorado, and they sit there and they shove 5 ballots into a device before they shoot it with ESD, as he was talking about. Then, when they're done shooting it with the ESD gun, they put 5 more, that's the lightning, that's 5 more ballots in. And that's all my guys do, all day long, because we have to be involved in that. The guy who actually is conducting the test is an expert in EMC, EMI stuff. He knows what he's doing, but my guy's out there to shove 5 ballots in it before he shocks it and shove 5 ballots in it after it's over. It's called a pre and post operational check. I can't even tell that guy, here's your procedure, shove these 5 ballots in and do that. The program does not allow it right now. So usability, accessibility, hardware testing for sure. There are lots of these things that other labs are experts in. I was having a discussion earlier about even security. Well, the program that went on with DHS, with the pilot program that they're running and currently running another one, those guys are not just experts in security. I mean, they're very high-level experts in security versus me going across the street and asking some guy to run a pen test. You know, they'll just do the standard best practices stuff, whereas the DHS guys are a lot better at that. So I'm thinking that some of this stuff could be compartmentalized and just hand over reports to the VSTL, and the VSTL reviews the reports.
Okay, as long as it's open, I guess, is the main thing. Thank you.
Sure.
I guess I just want to say that I feel that we have invested quite a great deal in making sure that our testers, our engineers, are knowledgeable in many of the areas. And so I would hope that if we brought another lab into it, you know, to do specified testing, that the labs that are already in place are still able to do, you know, across the board, if you feel that we're qualified to do that work.
Question was more so if you didn't have that expertise, could you subcontract with someone else, or, you know, someone else do that sort of the testing?
It would be nice to be able to subcontract some of those other things too. I think I just want to make a point too that, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been just one lab. I've heard that in a few of the public hearings, and there's always been at least two. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. So following on that, do you see a need for an additional lab?
Can I start?
Either end of you, yeah.
Go ahead, Tracy.
At times, I think that, you know, part of the reason why we do health IT certification testing is because of the ups and downs with voting system certification testing. We also, as you know, we're owned by GLI, which is Gaming Laboratories International. And so we're able to use resources back and forth because there's ups and flows in all areas. I think that for a lab that does only voting system certification testing, the work is minimal at times. And that has been something that we've struggled with in the past. And so trying to keep 3 labs busy, I think, is hard, but I also see where everyone is at, and if one should go away, you know, right now, and we've only got 2, that's not a good thing for anyone.
So in 2006 or 7 timeframe, there were 4 labs. There was iBeta, SLI, Wiley, and Cyber. And they all were trying to get a market that's about $6 million is all that's in the testing market. So those 4 quickly, one of them never, I don't think, even did a test campaign, which was Cyber. They rolled out of it. And then it was Wiley, iBeta, and SysTest. Then iBeta rolled out of it, and it became Wiley and SysTest, or SLI by then. Y'all changed names by then, I think, to SLI. Well, it's the same people. It's just it's SLI. And then I propped up ProVNV in 2011 and got accredited in 2015, which brought us back to 3. And almost immediately within a year, NTS, who had bought Wiley, is gone. So before there was an EAC and before there was this testing, there was SysTest and Cyber, and those were the 2 labs. So before there was EAC, there were 2 labs, and it seems like right now we're at 2 labs, and every time we try to expand, there doesn't seem to be enough work to keep 3 afloat. So that's my opinion on that.
Thank you. Ms. Mapps, you mentioned the issue of ambiguity under 1.0. If you can, what few areas did you see the most requests for interpretations under 1.0? And actually, you can answer that too.
Shoot, I was going to say, Jack, help me think here.
It's all over the map. I mean,
Yeah, it
so
really
there are
is.
places in the requirements that it says your font has to be a minimum of 4 millimeters to 6 millimeters. And then there's another one that says it's got to be between like 3 and 5. But those 2 things contradict each other. You can't have both. You can't meet both requirements. So somebody's got to select one. Even in the new standard that came out 1.1, there is a listing. One of the requirements is that you're listed on the national registry or the national test lab. So basically, it's product safety. You have to be listed. And another one, it says you have to be certified. And those 2 words are 2 very different things. One costs about $50,000 more than the other one, and you've got to do it annually. But those 2 things contradict, and somebody's got to decide which one is right. And that's where a lot of the stuff from 1.0 and even in 1.1 still hasn't been determined in 1.1. But there's about 5 or 6 things that I know my lab has submitted that somebody's got to make a determination on when a manufacturer comes through for 1.1. They contradict each other.
But I think Jack's correct that it's across the board. It's everywhere from hardware to code review to security. It's across the board. It really is.
Mr. Hall, you mentioned the, setting the bar. So we're talking about reliability here, and you were saying that perhaps, and I think Mr. Cobb, you were saying this as well, that perhaps the labs would anticipate some changes in the requirements and start building those into their systems. But my concern is actually the opposite, that they would not do it, that they would wait until it was actually required of them. I mean, even simple things like increasing the size of an oval, we've heard, is a very long process for them, sometimes 2 or 3 years to change that in one of their systems. So my concern is if we're updating these every year, are we going to have enough reliability that the labs are actually, or the manufacturers are actually going to, continue to sink resources into changing their systems or waiting for us to update those requirements?
Yes, so I would say I think this is, as long as there is sort of a moving bar, sort of a bar that changes in time, I think the writing is going to be on the wall that you're, as a manufacturer, you need to have a continual process to change your system. And that means both to cover things that we didn't know were problems, years ago, to things that that could use little tweaks here and there. And so part of what I think we're seeing, if the manufacturer can't increase the size of an oval for whatever reason, is more this sort of what I would call the phase change legacy of the voting system standards now, in the sense that they are these things that don't change that often, and when they do, they change massively. And so they are thinking that I don't want to change this little tiny thing because it may have other implications and I may have to go back through this very hard certification process again, rather than having the certification process maybe be difficult for that first time and then having smaller little changes that allow you to sort of evolve your system in time rather than have it sort of frozen at a 10 or 5 year kind of a basis. But as you're saying, it's hard to predict these things. These are huge socio-technical systems with very small margins. Like, part of it is like, if we can get more money in the system, there'll be more people to produce voting systems, we hope, and more testers and things like that. So there's some of this is, we don't know what's going to exactly happen until we start to try and change the system to be a little bit more flexible, which is what you're dealing with right now. And so we could entirely, unfortunately, be in the situation you're talking about, Chairwoman, in the sense that if the manufacturers don't have the proper incentives to continually evolve their systems, which means a healthy voting systems market, which is part of what I really want to see, then there's very little they can do to justify the continual investment that's going to take and the continual interaction with voting system test labs, which is going to be an ongoing thing.
And I guess what I'm saying is, if it's going to take them 2 to 3 years to change the size of an oval, which things do we know are going to be that kind of lag time? I mean, how do we know which things in their systems are going to take forever, and is it going to be a disincentive to, continue to innovate?
Yeah.
Because they're just going to be waiting to see what they're going to be required.
I think we have an idea of some things are much harder than others. For example, moving your system from a programming language that is that is considered type unsafe to one that is considered type safe. It's a really big deal, but it is very hard for you to completely change your source code to adapt to this new thing. It's something I hope everyone thinks about because it means we have fewer flaws in these systems. But ovals should not be the thing that would take us 2 or 3 years to change. And so maybe we can even drill down with the manufacturers about that particular concern, because it may be aspects of how their system.
Well, I mean, in any case, not the requirements aren't the only things that need to be flexible. The manufacturers also need to be flexible,
True.
and that is a problem of resources and sunk costs, right?
Yeah.
And that's, in every industry, but in this one, we have such a small market that it's very difficult without the resources and without the right liability to know what the manufacturers are going to be able to do.
Totally.
Jack, did you
I'd
have
like to
something
speak
say?
to that. Yeah, I've heard the same stuff you've heard for years and years and years about how hard and how long it is. I just find it very interesting that some manufacturers have on paper the next 2 years what systems are coming out. They can tell you what they're going to be certifying in 2021. They've already got it all planned out. So I don't understand if they have something like changing an oval that they know they're going to have to do in 2 years, that should be on that schedule somewhere. And then you've got other manufacturers, though, not all manufacturers that way. You have other manufacturers that literally what RFP just hit, that's what they're doing with their system right now. We need to be able to go to South Carolina because they have this one requirement, so we're starting to develop the requirement because there's an RFP out. So, you know, it's a lot on them, but if they do it properly and schedule it out, they should be able to adjust to things over a 2 or 3 year period that the bar is going to be over here in 2 to 3 years.
If they know it's coming.
If they know it's coming.
So,
Agreed.
I mean, that's the problem, right? If we're updating these every year and suddenly the disability community says, no, we think it should be, you know, a quarter of an inch larger, whatever that is. I mean, that doesn't give them the 2 years. We're waiting for them for 2 years to then catch up with that. So trying to figure that out, I think, is a difficult, you know, if we're updating standards all the time. I think the manufacturers really need some more reliability to sink their costs in, especially in such a limited market. Dr. Hall?
And this is why we tried to sketch out this sort of moving 5-year window where you can at least, you know that these exist now, they've been approved by whatever process exists to approve them. And then if you commit to them, you have 5 years to test to those, and you can continue to test those or any newer one. And if you do something like that, and this is very sketchy, so I don't want to no one should run out and do this, but we should talk about it. If we can do that kind of a thing, they know that they have 5 years, and if they don't want to invest in anything else, they can do that. But they also know if they want to be viable and not have this huge barrier to jump over in 5 years, then they're going to want to continually make little tiny steps towards that barrier over time.
We hope, but, you know, as Mr. Cobb was saying, you know, you noted that 1.1 was written long before we had a reestablished quorum on the commission, and we once we got reinstituted, that we then passed 1.1. It's now been over 4 years since we passed 1.1, and we still don't have a system brought into 1.1. So, which, I mean, that's a long period of time for the manufacturers to know. They knew since 2007 at least what we were going to put in 1.1, and yet here we are 4 years after passing 1.1, and we have 0 systems testing to that. So, you know, I hear the complaints about how it's not flexible enough, but nobody's bringing anything into that set of requirements. So, you know, it's kind of hard to make that argument that they aren't getting enough leeway, right? I mean, can you explain to me why they aren't bringing anything into 1.1? Any of you?
No.
No.
I can only speculate that they see the necessary changes to get to 1.1 to be so huge that they're going to wait for whatever's after 1.1. And that's what this is. But I don't know.
They've had 4 years. We'll probably not see these requirements for a couple more years. I mean, in reality, by the time we pass these, it's going to be a couple years before they can even get the systems on the market. We've got, you know, requirements to pass. We've got test assertions to be written, however we do that. And then we have to wait for the design of these systems to 2.0. So, I mean, now we're talking almost a decade since the 1.1 standards were being discussed, and yet nothing. So that's a concern of mine as well. So, you know, when you hear these complaints, it's kind of hard to say, you know, there's something to them when you've had 10 years to establish something under a new set of standards and you didn't do it.
Yes, and just to your point, the 1.1 was just a pulling forward of the 2007/next iteration that was written in 07. Those were the ones that were supposed to be the easy ones to incorporate.
Exactly.
They didn't leave the hard rewriting of the source code stuff in there. They just pulled forward the stuff that was out for public comment, and most everyone agreed that it wasn't a real heavy lift. Yet we've attempted to test one manufacturer to 1.1, and they pulled out of the program. But other than that, no one has even addressed it. There is a manufacturer who is currently on target to come in to try to do 1.1, but nobody has done it yet.
And something you said, Ms. Maps, that kind of concerns me. Have you been involved at all in the current discussions of the requirements for 2.0?
No.
Not even in the public working groups or anything? So NIST has not talked to you about it, or the AC has not talked to staff?
We started to participate in the public working groups. I think that those were a little bit chaotic, and I'll be honest, maybe a little bit of waste of our time. There was supposed to be a working group that was put together that was to involve both of the test labs, and that one has not been put in place. We have not been asked to participate in that one yet.
And I would hope that you would have something to do with the test assertions. I mean, I know that they probably aren't to that point yet, but
I don't know how far along they are with it, but we have not heard anything as of yet.
They set up the working groups and they compartmentalize things, but a lot of the working groups have been taken over with people with agendas. And so it's always the same thing being spoken the same time, and not a lot has been able to get done. But the test assertion group was really isolated to us and a couple of other entities, like some guys from NIST and stuff like that. But we haven't worked any on it from my lab.
Yeah, we were told months ago that we were going to go ahead and set up that meeting, and that one was going to be the working group that we were really going to work through things, and it would be ideal for the test labs, but we haven't moved forward on that.
so even though it might have been sort of a good idea, there were implementation problems with these groups that really haven't been helpful.
I think it was a good idea. I think that there's so many people involved, and maybe some people who don't have, lack for a better word, real life experience in testing voting systems. Some of these people I don't think have ever actually sat down to a voting system and tried to execute a requirement. I think that there was just a lot of back and forth in those meetings, and we've only got so much time to dedicate to overhead anyway, and so we felt like we would wait until there was a meeting that was just more effective.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the questions, so I will go for a second round with my other commissioners. Do you have any more questions, Commissioner Hovland?
Thank you. I did have one other one. It was mentioned earlier that, I guess, as we think about the structure and obviously principles and guidelines and then requirements, there was some talk that there are sections of the requirements that may be able to be parsed out, and at other hearings we've sort of hit on at least the external technical standards that are referenced, and we were talking about a little bit earlier with the lightning. But particularly as individuals who have worked with the requirements way more than me, do you see other natural sections of them that could be broken out, or I guess themes within the requirements that would fit into categories?
I'm going to get the low-hanging fruit on this. We are required to get A2LA or NVLAP, those are accreditation bodies. We're required to select hardware laboratories that have those accreditations. And then those people do all the testing except for my 5 ballots before and 5 after. For me, it's always been an easy task for a manufacturer to go contract that lab and give me a report. That's just really, really low-hanging fruit. They're already going to some of these labs and doing what's called pre-testing, pre-certification testing. They're testing it to make sure they can pass because they don't want to spend $60,000 twice. They would rather go get it and make sure it's right before they go to the labs. And if they do their pre-cert and then they could provide a report on it, why do I have to send my guy out to send 5 ballots and you're going to go back through it again? And so that's just really low-hanging fruit. There's been discussions also about the usability requirements, because there are human factors laboratories out there. We don't have specific expertise in this stuff, but there are labs that do have specific expertise in human factors. So those are 2 easy ones.
Right now, though, we're not doing testing in the human factors. We review the reports. So I think that the way that it works right now makes sense, because we're not testing, we're reviewing the reports that of the testing that's been done at other labs. I agree with the hardware testing. I think security is something that we really need to look at. That's one area that I feel like if we were to make any improvements or any adjustments right now and do this in a phased approach, security would be the number one.
And just to clarify, I guess as I think about breaking these up in such a way that it has been highlighted that there are maybe some that it would be more appropriate or desirable for the commissioners, and then some that are maybe less necessary. Do you see natural boundaries within? My understanding is that a lot of the requirements from 1.0 and 1.1 will be coming forward because they're in issue areas that maybe haven't changed substantially. But would you see any natural boundaries within the existing requirements that would lend themselves to, if we were entertaining some way to divide them up in or prioritize which ones are appropriate for certain levels of review?
Thoughts. I always have thoughts. Certainly the things that don't change much, like clearance, measurements and the accessibility, but less the usability evaluation of accessibility of these systems, but more the general sort of fit and purpose design stuff. I think the military standard stuff, the shake and bake stuff, like a lot of that stuff, anywhere where you see the VVSG sort of hanging a certain requirement on an external requirement or external standard, that's probably a pretty good place. I'm sure they have different ideas about which one of those are particularly good. I don't know anything about that, but those seem like natural places for that, I would think.
I agree.
I agree also.
Thank you all.
Commissioner Palmer, you have additional questions?
Yes, Madam Chair. This question is for Dr. Hall, but any can answer. The discussion about transitioning from one testing regime, the VVSG, to another, you mentioned hard boundaries. Were you talking, and could you clarify that a little bit about, I think it gets sort of into the point of how do we incentivize moving to 2.0? Obviously, I think money from the Congress might do that, some needs of the community. What did you mean by hard boundaries?
So there should be a point past which you can't test to old standards, to things that essentially are so outdated that they don't provide as much value. In fact, they may be counterproductive to test against. I don't have anything particularly at mind. I could take that as for the record and outline a couple of them. But right now, it would be really nice to have most machines sold such that they had been tested to standards that had been within the past 5 years rather than 10 or even longer, right? That's me waving my hand saying that feels right, and I'm not sure. There's all these other moving pieces that we need to make sure the right incentives are in place for manufacturers and that it's not too much of a burden on the testing process. But that feels like a really basic thing that we could set as sort of a goal for the new VVSG, in the sense that, hey, if 5 years from now things are humming along and we don't have this problem where manufacturers are holding back and trying to not do a whole bunch of things, rather that they're continuously improving their systems, that feels like a much better place to be than where we are now. So something, and you could even say, this is probably not the right answer, voting systems shall not be tested to standards more than 5 years old. I don't know that that's the right thing, but I think having at least a clear writing on the wall that if you wait too long, you're going to have an even harder time making it to more modern standards. That seems to be a really important thing to build into the system, so that voting machine manufacturers sort of see the writing on the wall, that there will be a time in the not too distant future where they're going to have to modify their systems to meet more modern requirements.
Mr. Cobb, Ms. Matt.
I guess my question would be, doesn't that need to be driven by the market, by the states themselves? I mean, it's a voluntary program, and so if you require manufacturers to test to the 2.0, but states aren't requiring that, then they may not. I feel like it needs to be something that's driven by the market. There are a lot of states out there that don't require, even the 1.0. Some of them are still stuck with VSS. And I don't know of states that have moved to the 1.1 yet either. And so I think it has to be driven by the market.
I'm sort of in line with Tracy on this. If the underlying states that are going to be buying these or certifying for use in their states, if they're not going to require it, they're not going to move towards it. And I think everybody in like the 05, 06 time period started saying you've got to have an EAC certified system, you know, and there were states that required an EAC certification. And then they kind of got burnt with that, with what happened. So then they went and changed their actual laws. And now it's independently federal laboratory or so, you know, they put creative words in there so they don't get stuck. So if they go change their laws and say you have to be VVSG 2.0, well, what happens when VVSG 3.0 comes out or something? You got to go back to the legislature and you got to get this changed again. So I think we're going to see maybe procedurally where they could do it, but if it's just procedurally, then somebody can willy-nilly change it. And the manufacturers are going to go get their lobbyist, and they're going to go try to get that changed so that it's not in law. So it's really easy to change. Y'all just put pressure on them, and they'll change it. So I don't know. It's always been a problem going back to even the 2002 to 2006. Until somebody forces them to do it, they're just going to keep going down the path they're going down because it's actually the one they know the best. I mean, going to 1.1 is a change for them. And why change if I know how to do 1.0? And so they just keep going the way they're going until somebody makes them change.
Adversarial testing and vulnerability handling. There's been some discussion by Ms. Mabs regarding security at our labs, and we can improve that. One of the recommendations was a security testing program evaluator for the EAC, sort of identify, assess the quality, and potentially require them to do penetration firms outside to fulfill that testing aspect. Could you explain that a little bit more? And I'd like to get the opinions of the labs of having that sort of additional programmatic change if there was funding at the EAC for that.
Sure, yeah. So I participated in 2007 in the California Top to Bottom Review and the Ohio Everest Review, which were academic projects to do open-ended vulnerability testing, which has a bad reputation. That term said like that, open-ended vulnerability testing, makes people think, oh, geez, you could do anything you want. There's no standard. And of course, that's not true. It's in cybersecurity, we call it penetration testing. There are frameworks for this. But the point is that we need to make sure that, and it sounds like we may not need to require testing labs to necessarily seek out expertise that's very particular to that kind of a task. It sounds like they may know that they would like to be able to subcontract some of that stuff out to firms, and there's dozens, if not hundreds of firms that can do this kind of stuff. But that's a place where what we see in information systems is typically when you get a penetration testing group to come in and attack your system, they find as many vulnerabilities as you have time to engage them, which can be really expensive in some cases. You know, you want to keep it very well cabined and well scoped. But those vulnerabilities necessarily go back to the manufacturer, and that's why the more important part of that recommendation is the next piece, that they have standard, these are ISO standards, handling processes, which make sure that you can actually accept the report of a vulnerability and make sure within some amount of time it's fixed. And then reporting processes so that people like me who occasionally bang away at voting machines can report a vulnerability in a safe way. And so it gets kind of complicated. You don't want to just send an email because, you know, the Russians could be looking at your email, right? And they'll know about that vulnerability test. So you have to do something a little more complicated about that. But I think this is where either, and maybe this is a NavLab thing, I'm not sure. This is where even my knowledge of this gets really fuzzy. But to the extent that we can assess if the security testing is fulfilling its need in terms of actually producing systems that are harder for people like me to break into, and I do it not as a bad guy, right? I do it only at the invitation of people that own the systems. I'd never do that. That's something that I've seen lacking for a very, very long time. And it would be the kind of thing where you guys could, if you had the means, hire someone who could say, well, this looks all great. There's a couple of tweaks right here. Either the testing labs can deal with that and take that feedback back, or maybe this is something that you can subcontract out to a firm, many dozens of which exist, that particularly are experts in that thing. And I say this because penetration testing is an area where some people who do this all day, every day, and they develop a level of expertise that when you work with these folks on your system, you're like, oh, wow. I had no idea that was possible. It's almost like magic. But once you learn that, you benefited from their expertise, and now you fix the system. And I'm just not sure that the current testing system is set up for that. And these folks could feel free to correct me.
I'd like to address the term that we keep using, subcontract. The VSTLs are not allowed to subcontract work out in the current. I cannot go pick a human factors lab and say, will you do the testing for me because you're an expert at this? It's not allowed. The whole concept of us subcontracting out is banned in the program. So with that said, I have thought about this idea, and this was some time back, and I don't know, but we require them to have a summative usability test before they get an approved application. What would stop us from saying you have to have a hardware test laboratory report before you submit an application, a usability test before you submit an application, a security test penetration test before you even submit an application? You could take those 3 or 4 things and make the manufacturers go do these before they can even come into the program. And what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with much more mature systems that have been looked at from many different angles before they're even applying for the EAC. Now you're looking at a test scenario of 3 or 4 months instead of years because you failed some requirement in hardware testing that shouldn't have even been in here. You should have pre-tested, and it shouldn't have even been in the application form because you failed ESD. Well, don't bring it to us unless you can pass certain levels of things, and it doesn't even reflect on the EAC, except it's now gotten cheaper, and now it's gotten a lot more efficient because you're bringing me something that is much more mature.
I think that, those aren't bad ideas. I think something to consider is that from a security test standpoint, I will say that, we have certified individuals that have undergone extensive audits, undergone certification training in CISSP, ethical hacking, whatever that one is, a whole bunch of them. I think that you have to be careful with security testing because, one, I can almost guarantee you it won't be cheaper to go outside to an outside security subcontractor. It's going to be less expensive for you to do that testing with us than it would be one that charges well over $200 an hour. And so I think that's something to consider. They may bring a different aspect. They may look at it differently than we do, but they also don't have the expertise that we do from a voting system standpoint. And I think that that plays a big part in it too. I'm not saying that it's the wrong thing to do and that, it doesn't make sense to have some outside assistance, but I do think that we need to have an appreciation for the experience that we have within the labs as well. I think that the program does allow some contractor use, just not in certain core areas. And so that would need to be something that we would look at. But again, that's why I say I would like to still be able to conduct all of this testing ourselves if we are qualified. If someone wants to come in and do audits, I'd be more than happy to hear about how we might be able to improve and if we're not meeting expectations. I feel that we do, and that I would like to be able to continue doing that ourselves too. Just some extra things to consider.
That's all the questions I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Commissioner Hicks, do you have any further questions?
I just have a couple, thank you. One thing that just popped in my head was, are there any states that submit to you outside of, our testing and certification program overall, but do they submit to you testing for e-poll books or other aspects as well?
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, Dr. Hall, the one question that I keep having in my head about the with your written testimony is the ability to withstand scrutiny by trained security experts under the adversity testing and vulnerability handling. When you say trained experts, what does that mean?
That means people who spend all their time breaking into systems.
For pay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of us do it for fun too, but
Because I guess I go into the question of some states have asked people to come in and do like assessments for them, and then instead of going to the state with that information, they go public. And
that's completely unethical.
Yeah.
I mean, that I could get red in the face and tell you how inappropriate that is, but your duty as a tester is to the person who hired you and then the person who can fix the system, right? And anything else, unless I can't imagine That just does not sound, that's not something that I think I or any of my friends would do.
My last question goes to Ms. Mapps, and it's the something you said kind of is disconcerting to me in terms of not being willing to, because I think you all bring a wealth of knowledge to this, and but for you to say that you're that it's not worth the time and effort to do the public working groups is something that, you know, maybe we need to look at the format in the next iteration. You know, we haven't gotten to 2.0 yet, but I think of it as if we think of 2.2 or 2.5, 3.0, whatever, to think about how those public working groups were set up and so forth, because you're not the first that I've heard say that.
Well, and I apologize for that wording. Maybe I shouldn't have used those terms exactly.
No, I think that's helpful.
Okay.
No.
I do feel that they could, there could be some changes to those.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Just following on that a little bit, the principles and guidelines document that we have out for public comment right now, I think you all have said that these upper-level aspirational principles, it's hard to disagree with any of them, really. If we don't connect if we look at the requirements separate from that document, well, first of all, do we need to attach the requirements to those upper-level principles?
I mean, absolutely, you want to make sure the requirements all together meet the goal of the principles, which is why it's going to be interesting to see what the robust and graceful one looks like. I mean, I'm sure someone could do a good job of it, but.
So you would all agree that they need to be attached, right?
Or at least to be able to see those before we're able, you know, before we can approve, or I can give, you know, my approval, if it matters, on the principles and guidelines.
But if we pass these principles and guidelines, the 2.0, they're so broad in their scope and so aspirational. Would we ever need, and we call those 2.0, would we ever need a 3.0, or would we just continually change the requirements?
I think that was the purpose of why 2.0 was developed, is that it would cover what a voting system is thought to function like and be required to function like today, but it should function that way in 20 years as well. Even if technology changes, you know, we're talking about wireless. Well, we don't know. Wireless may be the safest thing in 20 years. We don't know. I mean, it could be. So, you know, by just coming up with the principles and guidelines of what a voting system has to be, then you can change underlying things as technology changes without going through the whole process of advisory boards and standards boards and things of that nature.
So we wouldn't need those boards anymore, is that right?
I don't know.
I think they'll be very helpful in making sure that the requirements actually meet the principles and guidelines. And to resonate with what Tracy and Jack have said, you hopefully never need another version of the principles and guidelines once they're set in stone, in the sense that really that should be like a constitutional document. I keep on using that, and I mean, I don't want to have voting system constitutional scholars who are like reading between the lines of the principles and guidelines, but the idea is that hopefully those need to change as little as possible, because that's such a high level view that we can all agree that we're all here to make voting awesome, and these are the ways to do that. Whereas how we identify the requirements and the versions of those are almost going to have to be on a dated basis. Like, this raft of requirements was finally complete on this day, and so you're testing against those particular ones. And so there's probably going to be a bunch of versions, I would think, of the requirements if they're changing in a flexible way to where they evolve separately from the 2.0 principles and guidelines.
So if we're having staff do those updates, would there ever be a need for the commissioners to do anything after this?
I think the commissioners, the staff, and the TGGC and the boards of advisors and standards should be able to identify, this is one you're particularly going to want to run all the way up and make sure that there's a more rich process around, whereas other ones like the military standards, those are things that are not something that you guys need to worry a whole lot about.
So if we passed a set of requirements, could we asterisk those places and say, or current standard?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And leave it at that as the
Yeah.
flexibility for the external standards?
I think so. Yeah.
Would you consider the requirements to be policy?
hopefully if they're written well, they shouldn't be. But it's hard for me to look at the entire VVSG and think of that as,
So whether or not there's a barcode on the ballot, that would not be policy? Or in connection to the internet? Or
no,
that would not be policy?
those are technical, absolutely.
Those would all be technical. That wouldn't be, commissioners shouldn't have to bother to worry about whether there's a barcode on there or not,
There may be other considerations.
or whether there's a VVPAT.
That would require the commissioners to think about it and actually say, no, this is one we're going to stop without these kinds of modifications. But I wouldn't call it as a policy technical distinction. I would be more like, they should be all technical, but occasionally there are going to be some pretty serious train wrecks of technical issues that may result in a policy matter that you're going to have to
How
struggle
would
with.
we know when that is going to happen?
Someone will tell you, and if we can actually.
So we're just supposed to sit and wait for someone to
you
complain?
can too.
The train wreck or before the train?
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully, way before the train wreck. I mean, you don't want to be fixing up the train wreck.
I think there's some hot button issues that come up from time to time that are still technical in nature, but they're political in nature because it's a hot button. The Wi-Fi is a great example. I mean, we actually had a voting system in the 06, 07 time period that has now been decommissioned, as far as I know, everywhere, but it used wireless. And so that is a big political thing, but it's also a very technical thing. So they're going to be.
Perhaps that's why HAVA was written the way it was, with putting commissioners over this process.
I think that the policy side of some of the decisions are meant for you guys to make that decision on a policy side. But there are always technical provisions that you won't be arguing with. If I design a volume and stress test for a certain system, do you need to approve that that's a volume and stress test? No.
We haven't so far, correct?
Exactly. Well, actually, it's in the VVSG in Appendix B, writing in a test plan. That's the only place it's mentioned anywhere. So, it's like, that was approved in the standards, but if we approve this document, it doesn't have any of that stuff in there. There isn't any. So
we wouldn't have any more oversight once we pass this.
you would have I'm envisioning, and this is all a procedure thing that is going to have to be developed, but I'm kind of envisioning there are some items that y'all are going to want to have input on that may be political or policy in nature, but there are others that they're strictly technical. And in the VVSG currently, Volume 2 tells me how I'm supposed to test everything. And so that whole volume is just how I'm supposed to test stuff.
Should the requirements be a package?
I'm going to defer to.
I mean, if we're changing them all the time, is that a good thing or not a good thing? I mean, does that give the, reliability that the manufacturers are going to need to sink their resources into designing systems?
So you're going to have to be able to identify a coherent set of requirements that test labs can test to. That doesn't mean that they need to be all done at once, but it does mean that at some point you say that's enough baked to where these folks can run with it and test something against, and manufacturers can say, I can build something to that. That requires a little bit more writing and words to think about what exactly that looks like. But even then, that seems vastly superior to the throw it over the
Yeah, happy
wall.
to take some recommendations on how to do that, because I think that's, great in theory, but once you try to figure it out, it's almost an impossibility to figure out where that line is.
Yeah, and this is why we suggested a joint workshop exactly about the evolution of voting system standards with NIST. You could have a policy side and a technical side that really dug into all those individual considerations. I don't have all the answers, and man, I would want to benefit from folks like this in terms of doing the right thing.
I would like to just add to that a little bit. And I envision, and this is just me, but I kind of envision the principles and guidelines don't need changing. The requirements need a little changing every once in a while, but the test assertions are going to be changing the most. And that's how we test to a requirement.
Right.
So if we make a broad generalization like I did earlier about accuracy, well, we may change in 5 years what that definition of accuracy is by testing it to a different level. Maybe more, maybe less in some areas. But I just kind of see with what they're laying out, the test assertions requirements and the principles and guidelines, as you go up the chain, they get from the bottom to the top, they don't get changed that much. The assertions get changed quite often, the requirements get changed less, and the principles and guidelines don't get changed very often at all.
Okay.
Can I ask a couple
Sure.
clarifications?
Yeah.
I just had a couple clarification questions based on Commissioner McCormick's questions. Dr. Hall, where you were saying to see them together, did you mean that you should see the requirements should align with the principles and guidelines, but they don't necessarily need to be one document?
Yeah, I meant that they can't be completely divorced from each other. Like, you want to make sure that these requirements add up to meet the goal of the principles and guidelines, but
And-
not that they have to be stapled to each other.
And so, particularly with the references to a sort of constitutional-like structure, maybe VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines would last for a longer period of time, but in that we might see requirements, I guess I'll go with 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then when you were talking about the barcode example, and you were saying that was technical, would you say that's because in the instances that barcode has been brought up in recent times, that as long as it meets the principle of auditability, that should solve, or that's what allows that to be technical, is because the requirement and or the test assertion still has to meet the guideline or the overarching principles and guidelines?
So I could geek out on barcodes. Essentially, you want to have a set of requirements that assure that you have only enough information in a barcode and not too much, because they're what we call a ripe area for covert channels, sort of things that could be used to communicate other things about voters. Sounds very conspiracy theorist, but it's just what we think about when we think about theoretical attacks. But certainly, I think it's just to the extent that, what is that barcode being used for? Is it encoding a vote for a particular race? Is it like in the LA County system, encoding a vector, encoding a list of all the choices you've made? There's very different sort of designs for what the barcode would be. All of them roll up to counting and auditing depending on how it's being used. And so I think I may have lost your question, but I don't. Feel free to ask me again. I'm sorry.
Just the reason that was technical was because it ultimately still had to apply to one of the principles and guidelines, and so, or several, all of them. But so if someone was using a barcode in a way that would be in violation of a principle and guideline, that would be technical to be determining whether or not that was the case.
Absolutely, like unique identifiers embedded in ballot. Unique identifiers embedded in barcodes is something I would be really worried about, and I would hope that there would be a
privacy.
requirement that would say that this is not allowed. That because then you could find someone's ballot based on something that they weren't aware was on the ballot, and that's something we'd want to avoid.
Thank you. And one last sort of, I guess, concept, and I'll skip HAVA for the moment. Just, I know it's there, but just to hear, from this conversation and what you all feel is the ideal, it sounds like, number one, I'm hearing something about if people were able to appeal a requirement or a decision made by staff up to us, that may be an option.
Yeah.
But then can you also comment about, I guess, looking at that there are a number of requirements that will be carrying over from 1.0 to 2.0. If once, would there be value, or do you see value in setting up a system where essentially once a requirement is passed, it exists until, and then maybe there's an annual review or some kind of periodic review, and or an opportunity to appeal up that one is maybe outdated, but otherwise, it feels like a lot of the burden of this process over time has been that you have this large, thousands of requirements document, and I don't know, I'm sure that there are things, obviously cybersecurity from 2005 to now is a totally different world, but there are other aspects that it is the same world. Do you think that that would be a useful or feasible way to approach the requirements?
Yes, I think there are things that are going to be political in nature and policy in nature, and y'all are just talking about barcodes, for instance. Well, the first thing that I thought in my head, I wasn't getting into the security side of all this. I was just sitting there. The barcode should have what they say is in the barcode, and nothing else. That's the way I look at it. But he's looking at it from a different vector. Well, a barcode on a ballot, you can make the requirement that you can have no barcodes on the ballot, when really the barcode on the ballot just puts in the ballot ID, like the ballot style, where it's located, you know, what precinct, what machine it can go in is in the barcode. And that's all that's in the barcode. Now, that's not very policy oriented because you've got the ballot style in the barcode, but someone like him may look at it and go, what's in the barcode? Well, the lab's going to go, this is what they say is in the barcode. It's what's in the barcode, and there's nothing else in the barcode. And we verified it. So those are technical in terms. For me, what's in the barcode's in the barcode, what they said's in the barcode. But from a policy side, somebody may bring to you, there's a security risk in all of this. Well, both things can happen at the same time, that it could be a policy issue and it can be a technical issue.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that I like the idea of being able to appeal. And I like the idea of sort of default okay. Like if it's been a requirement and there's been no challenge to it, then it should be fine. I do think it would be nice to see the testing labs look at some of the 1.1 or 1.0 or whatever stuff and be like, ooh, here's an opportunity to make this not as onerous or not as expensive or less more effective. And so, you know, in addition to there being an appeal process and a default approved kind of a thing, it should be really easy for someone in the community, maybe the community I don't know how we define that, but whatever. It needs to be easy for people to identify places that may need additional attention. And so in addition to appealing and default approved, there may be some sort of like, I don't know, nomination, I don't know what it is, some sort of process for saying, hey, this requirement may be a little bit more, may require a little bit more thought, and it might be a good candidate for one discussed in an EAC meeting or something else that where we can actually sort of have an airing and then get a decision on how that's going to go.
Maybe the appeal process, along with or identifying certain areas that if changes are made to those areas, those always need to come up to the EAC or to the commissioners.
I have an example of this exact situation. There's a requirement in the VVSG for the measurement of sound that comes out of the audio, and we had problems with it for years and years and years. We had to be in an anechoic chamber at night to even get it down to the 20 dB that it has to be. And then there's a requirement over here that says you can only go up by 5 dB per button push. We don't know where the 20 came from. We asked NIST. They don't know why they said that. They don't know where it came from. But what it causes is you have to put on a headphone and push the button 10 times before it gets to conversational sound. It's a requirement. It's written in there. There's no ambiguity. It's got to be at 20 dB, and it's got to go up by 5. Well, that is ripe for going, hey, this requirement needs to be changed somehow. And there's no way to do that currently unless you want to rewrite the entire standard.
That's a really good point. That's a good one.
Further questions? Commissioner Palmer?
Yes, I have a question or two. Thank you, Madam Chair. So there was some discussion about the timeline for changes of certain requirements, and how if we go years and years without any changes, we get stale. Would a normal 1 to 2 years, is that what you see as sort of like, well, once we pass 2.0, let's say, we're all fresh, right? Yeah. Well, sort of. Things change overnight often, but would you say a 1 or 2 year process going through the board system to get recommendations on changes to requirements to 1.0 or 2.0, sort of like that process?
So you're saying every 1 to 2 years, go through and do a review and make
Or every
changes
year.
at that time?
Or every year, doesn't necessarily have to be enacted, but a review of those requirements.
I guess it
that
depends on
adequate?
how long the approval process is, that you'd go through every year. I mean, if it's fairly quick, then maybe every year makes sense. I don't know, I'd hate to get just bogged down with this long approval process every year if we don't feel that there's really a need to go through all of them. I don't know. I would say almost every 2 years would be sufficient, and then really identifying what that approval process is or what that review period looks like.
So to kind of jump on that just a second, we have RFIs, and there are approximately 20 or 30 RFIs out there, somewhere in that neighborhood. But the first 2 or 3 years, you can mark off about half of them. And then as it got further and further down the line, I think the last RFI came out 2 years ago. So as the requirements matured, they may not need to be looked at as often. In the first couple of years, you may be changing lots of requirements as we start implementing them. But then it just kind of matures as it goes on, and they've been changed and updated, and everybody can work with them until something underlying changes, like a security posture or something like that.
Well, thank you all to each one of you for spending the time this afternoon. We could talk about this for a lot longer, actually, but we need to wrap it up and move on. So thank you for coming in today. Now we will have public testimony. We have 2 people who signed up, and so if you would come up one at a time. We have Guillermo Mena. And you will have 5 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've submitted the comments on the record, but I want to read a little bit to you, and thank you for all the work you've been doing, all of you, on this. I'm testifying against VVSG 2.0 for several reasons, and some of them have been discussed before, even today, and I'm glad I heard people referencing them. I think the language in many aspects is too vague and can lead to unintended consequences. For example, the term best practice, there's no reference to what those are, where a person should find them, who defines them, what minimum standards they should contain, except for one place where it says user-centered. When you know that for design, there are several documents of best practices available, competing, and they're very different. It says also commonly accepted election process specifications, that it should comply with that. When I think the role of this commission is to better the commonly elected process. I mean the commonly accepted process. That's the whole point. So why should a good system go with the commonly accepted process? The phrase is wide range of representative voters, different from the widest range of voters. I don't know what the difference between those are and what range refers to it. In one place it says disabilities, and another place I don't know if there's a leeway intended between those two. Currently accepted federal standards for accessibility. I imagine that's ADA, but I don't know if that's what it means. And the word currently is used several times without defining if it's meant to be when VVSG 2.0 is adopted, when the system is first put in place, or in every election. A consistent experience in all modes of voting, which is frankly impossible and even undesirable, because what we should strive for is the best possible experience for each particular mode of voting. The use of the word ballot to mean apparently 2 different things, what the voter interacts with and what is actually cast at the end. It doesn't address the concept of cast as intended, which is in Principle 7, but then when you go into the details, it doesn't say what that means, on how to define it or gauge it. It doesn't define the minimally acceptable number of quality of settings or preferences in Principle 7.1. It does not. It treats paper ballot systems sort of like an afterthought, requiring things like voters can adjust the settings and preferences to meet their needs, or configurable authentication mechanisms, or equivalent options in all modes of voting. It doesn't say what the minimally acceptable results for the measurements it requires in Principle 8.3, when it requires a wide range of representative voters to measure effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. What does that mean? It again, the malware, I think they address it better than I could. And VVSG 2.0 fails to define who will fill out or interpret the glaring gaps in its language, how stakeholders can request such definitions or interpretations, and what guarantees of impartiality come with that delegated authority. It implies that there will be a subsequent process to define the gaps, and we've talked about that today, but that it is not spelled out, and there are no guarantees regarding their content or their processes to comment on them. And the vagueness of it points to upcoming drawn-out arguments regarding what the document means to say. And I'm a lawyer. I'm here, I should have said, on behalf of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators, which is representing the almost 430 state legislators who are Hispanic across the United States. And I can see, even with the best of intentions, lawyers arguing about what this document meant to say and whether the regulations or requirements you're putting in place based on these actually comply with what the document meant to say in the beginning, instead of addressing what the problem it wants to address, instead of this general principles and what those mean. And I want to add, and it's not here, that I keep hearing here that the problem is that this commission was without members for many years, and that therefore the work stalled. I think the idea that passing the buck and to someone else to make the decisions will make the commission better turns the whole thing on its head. In order for a commission to be constantly with constant members and to make sure the president and Congress confirm people, is that the commission's work needs to be important to people. And no president takes a long time to appoint a new member of the Supreme Court, because everybody knows that membership is important. So it should be the same here.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your comments. Next, we have Maurice Turner.
Good afternoon.
Welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioners, for holding this meeting, providing the opportunity for public comment. My name is Maurice Turner. I'm Senior Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where I work with Joe on the Election Security and Privacy Project. VVSG are critical to the promulgation of high-quality principles, specifications, and requirements that ensure the integrity of every vote cast by every voter, including voters with accessibility needs. The importance of regularly updating the VVSG to remain relevant to addressing the ever-evolving needs of voters and threats to voting systems cannot be understated. Given the broad range of topics covered by the principles, I would like to focus my testimony on Principle 5, Principle 6, and Principle 8. HAVA calls for voters to be able to vote privately and independently without assistance from others. For millions of voters with visual, mobility, cognitive, and other disabilities, which make up 12% of the 2016 general election voting public, that means relying on accommodations, often through digital technologies. Some of this digital technology can be used independently and securely by leveraging the voter's own personal assistive technology. We saw some of that just last week at the National Federation for the Blind. For example, an online voter registration website can be designed to provide an equivalent and consistent experience to a sighted voter without assistance and to a non-sighted voter assisted by screen reading and voice input technologies that they use at home. Both experiences are secured using the same web-based security protocols implemented as part of the website's design. Ballot marking devices at polling places have flexible capabilities such as adjustable text size, multilingual audio, and personal input device interfaces that allow voters with disabilities the opportunity to interact with the same ballot as other voters. The same devices benefit all voters because their flexible capabilities provide the opportunity for increased functionality such as uniform ballot marking, prohibition of overvotes, and minimizing the conditions for coercion. Assistive technologies can address the concerns of multiple constituencies if they are designed, developed, and implemented with the guidance of thoughtful standards and requirements, such as those in the VVSG. The foreign interference of the 2016 elections has sharpened the priorities for local, state, and federal officials on the security of digital technologies used throughout the election systems. Unfortunately, many of those components and systems were designed, developed, and implemented using VVSG 1.1 and hopefully using VVSG 1.0 and hopefully 1.1 that are no longer adequate to meet today's security concerns. Beyond physical security and cybersecurity, there is an increased expectation of accountability in the election process as a means of reducing the ability of interfering with votes and voters. Components and systems must face a higher standard of robustness, safety, and verifiability, but not at the expense of usability and accessibility. Jurisdictions need to be able to look to VVSG 2.0 as they consider how their election models evolve to include vote by mail, electronic poll books, consolidated vote centers, and risk-limiting audits. All of those evolutions require substantial investments in digital technology that should serve all voters regardless of their abilities and without discrimination. Nearly every state relies on VVSG for their state certification process, and consequently, nearly every voter does as well. It is important that the EAC continues this open process of discussion and consideration to ensure that both security and accessibility concerns are addressed in the design of voting components and systems so that every voter benefits from the enhancements in privacy and accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Commissioners will have closing remarks now. Commissioner Hovland, do you have anything you have to say, would like to say at this point?
I would just like to thank all the witnesses again. We appreciate it.
Commissioner Palmer, do you have anything?
I concur with Commissioner Hovland.
Commissioner Hicks?
I want to third that. I think that it's very important. We heard a lot of things that I hadn't heard before. I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I want to thank all the witnesses for coming out today.
And I'd also like to thank all the witnesses for being here today. We had some interesting discussions, some new topics. It's a very complicated process, and all of your input is very much appreciated for us to get this right. So I want to thank you for being here again. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.